Wow, ECB chief Christine Lagarde is pushing the euro in the race against Bitcoin and gold. The ECB chief now wants to make the euro the global reserve currency. They're saying the global euro moment has arrived. She said this in the Financial Times, and it's absolutely huge. At the same time, they've been warning about Bitcoin and gold for years. They're practically scared of them. And now it all makes more and more sense. Do you guys remember these headlines? They're just a few weeks old, or maybe about a week old or so. ECB warns of a gold collapse. What you need to know. A banking crisis is looming and gold could trigger a short squeeze here. Or here in 2022. Bitcoin's final act. Bitcoin has no intrinsic value and is on its way to irrelevance. Here in 2024. We need laws to prevent the rise of the Bitcoin price. What's happening here is a master plan by Christine Lagarde, but not to free people. Instead, it's to finally enslave them, including with the digital euro and more. Let's take a look at the whole thing now. The blog trainer wrote a very good article about this. If you want more freedom here, if you stand for Bitcoin, then leave me a like below so that such devious plans don't succeed. But I'll tell you right up front, spoiler alert, whether this plan will actually succeed is pretty questionable. I mean, we're seeing all the trends. The US dollar is weakening. And of course, now there's a bipolar world. There are the BRICS nations, there's the Eurozone, and there are the USA. The USA is no longer the sole hegemon, the big boss calling all the shots. And now, of course, Christine Lagarde is catching wind of this and wants to have her big global euro moment. She's also making a statement. Let's take a quick look at what she has to say. She says here, "We are experiencing a profound transformation of the global order. Open markets and multilateral rules are falling apart, and even the dominant role of the US dollar, the cornerstone of the system, is no longer secure. In their place, we're seeing protectionism, zero-sum thinking, and bilateral power plays. This uncertainty is harming the European economy, which is deeply integrated into the global trading system." And this is actually a quote from Christine Lagarde, right here, where she says zero-sum thinking and so on. There's really nothing more zero-sum than fiat currencies, where you basically have just a handful of winners and a whole lot of losers. There are way more losers than winners. The problem you have here is that it kind of goes in the direction of the definition of insanity. We basically keep doing the same thing over and over, but expect different results or think that this time the outcomes will be different. That means, for example, if we replace the dollar with the euro, we still haven't fixed the fundamental problems, like having sound money, scarce money, decentralized money, or censorship-resistant money. So basically, we're just replacing one problem with the next problem. And then, here in the Eurozone, we also have the issue that we're in a currency union. That means we have economically strong countries and countries that aren't as strong economically. We throw them all into the same pot. And if the euro were to become the world's leading currency, it would of course gain massively in purchasing power and relevance. And it would become a strong currency, if it ever comes to that. And then, of course, there would be some really big problems. What would countries do then that aren't as economically strong, that might actually prefer to focus on exports or something like that? They would then be forced to become an import nation, just like the United States is. The US is now facing exactly this problem. They might more or less collapse or fail because of the Triffin dilemma, since having such a strong currency has, over time, led to their industry moving abroad. That means production was no longer done in America. Instead, it shifted to China and other countries. Then, thanks to the strong currency, all those goods were imported back in. And of course, the US was able to reap huge seigniorage profits by holding the world monopoly and printing money, while other people simply had to work for it. It also says here that the euro is supposed to stand up to the dollar, but not just the dollar, of course, also Bitcoin and gold. We'll get to that in a moment. She also says that such a step toward greater international significance for our currency will not happen automatically. It has to be earned. And of course, it could also mean that she's saying, okay, we now have to introduce a digital euro. She's always putting on pressure and creating a sense of urgency. Like, hey, wow, the digital euro is super important so we can keep up with the international players, so we can compete with the USA, have our own payment infrastructure, and so on and so forth, even though we already have a fully functional system. Bitcoin works, and it would even cover the store of value function, and so on. What's also very interesting here is this graphic. Here you can see the different world currencies. So, not all of them are global reserve currencies, but these are the most relevant currencies for comparison. And actually, not all of them are even currencies. In my opinion, gold and Bitcoin aren't currencies, but Bitcoin isn't even shown in this chart. So we can see that the dollar has been losing momentum for over 20 years now. In other words, it's becoming less and less relevant. At the same time, we have other currencies here. These are probably BRICS currencies and so on, that are gaining more momentum. We see gold staying relatively constant, but since 2020, it has picked up a bit more momentum. And the euro, which hasn't really gained much significance internationally. In fact, if we look at it compared to 2010, it's actually lost a bit of ground here. But gold, of course, has increased. Bitcoin is also on the rise, at least since 2015, 2016. are 2016, 2017. And now the question is, will the euro be able to make a big leap forward here? The article also mentions that central banks around the world are massively increasing their gold reserves, especially, for example, the Chinese central bank, if we look in that direction. And it's not just China. Other national, central banks and so on are also steadily increasing their gold reserves. And now there are also efforts to introduce Bitcoin reserves. That means we actually have some real competition here now. So it's not just that we're doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different outcomes, or that nothing will come of fiat money again, but that we might finally have some real contenders this time. In my opinion, gold isn't the right candidate either, because we've already tried it, but Bitcoin would actually be the right candidate here. I found that really, really funny. There was this Financial Times article that, well, the ECB posted, and someone commented underneath, Krog, what do you think about Lagarde's demand? Answer like Ludwig von Mises. So, Ludwig von Mises, a very well-known Austrian economist, who of course has already passed away. What would Ludwig von Mises have said about Christine Lagarde's plan? And now, just check out this answer. As Ludwig von Mises, I would firmly reject Lagarde's proposal to make the euro a global reserve currency. The euro is a fiat currency, vulnerable to inflation and manipulation by the ECB. I advocate for sound money like gold, which cannot be arbitrarily increased. Bitcoin, although new, could be interesting because of its scarcity. But the euro doesn't solve the problems of the dollar. It just shifts them. Both are fiat systems that promote instability. Only a return to sound money ensures long-term stability. And that's exactly the point that many people don't understand. They just think, okay, we'll just keep creating one fiat Ponzi scheme after another, and eventually it'll work out. And the thing is, there are people who benefit from the fiat system, but it's usually not the savers. I mean, you're always being dispossessed. Your purchasing power keeps decreasing. Seriously, ask yourselves, what sense does it make for your purchasing power to keep going down? It would make so much more sense for your purchasing power to increase as we have more productivity, more economic power, and so on. I mean, globally, everything is developing into a much more efficient, much better, much more technologically advanced world, and so on. And the only thing that keeps going backwards is the purchasing power of our money. Lagarde also emphasizes here that, basically, a currency needs to meet several criteria to be relevant in any way. She says, legal integrity, economic resilience, and geopolitical strength. That's basically what a currency depends on. And now we can take a look, for example, at legal integrity. So, what's probably meant here is whether you can rely on the rule of law, whether you can count on things like property rights and so on. And you have to say, at the moment it works reasonably well, of course. But we've seen time and again that banks fail. And then this and that happens. Just earlier, I saw this article here. All databases of Seva Bank, one of the largest banks in Iran, were deleted in a major cyber attack. All of their ATMs are out of service, so customers can't withdraw any cash. And that's basically the problem. Not only do you have issues with legal integrity, since property rights are issued by a central authority, but you also have issues with manipulability, economic resilience, and geopolitical strength. I wouldn't say that the EU has that much geopolitical strength. I mean, the next thing the EU is planning is some kind of global. Well, not really global, but more like an EU army or something like that. But if we just take a look at, okay, the military power of the USA compared to that of the EU, we're still nowhere near that level. I mean, I'm not an expert on conflicts or anything like that. I can't really. I don't know exactly how many tanks the EU has and how many the USA has. But you probably wouldn't have to look that up for long. You'd probably find out pretty quickly that the USA is still the world power when it comes to the military. And we always see, the one with the biggest bazookas and the biggest cannons has historically always issued the world's reserve currency and basically held the money monopoly. Because fiat money isn't secured like Bitcoin is by hash rate and Bitcoin mining, but rather, fiat money is fundamentally secured by weapons, by bazookas, by bombs. I just Googled it again because I was curious. Or rather, I had ChatGPT look up the information. So, militarily, the EU doesn't stand a real chance against the USA, not even together. Even if all EU countries work together perfectly, which they don't in reality, the USA would still be light years ahead. Without the USA, Europe would be extremely vulnerable. As long as the USA maintains its military power, the USD, that is, the US dollar, will remain dominant. The EU has virtually no chance of replacing the dollar. It lacks the military backing, political centralization, and geopolitical leverage needed for that. And that's also the next problem here, in a way. The EU isn't really pulling the emergency brake either. That means not all countries are pulling together here. There are also different interests at play. Some want to go in one direction, others want to go in another, and so on. And the core problem of the EU here, if you break it down, this is summarized really, really well here. ChatGPT summarized it here. Crazy. So attention, the core problem of the EU is this. The EU is an economic giant, a political dwarf, and a military child. And of course that's crazy, but it's actually true. Politically, Who even listens to the EU right now, to what the EU says? No one listens. All those people who sometimes fly to the US don't even get a welcome. There, not even the president bothers to, raise his hand or anything like that. Of course, that's a bit of an exaggeration. And what could actually become dangerous for the US dollar would be China, a strong economy, building up its military, but still lacking global trust. Or, on the other hand, Bitcoin, neutral, independent from any state, secured by mathematics. That's exactly why it's so dangerous for the existing fiat system. And those are probably the real contenders here, at least if you asked me, who could actually dethrone the US dollar. And if we look at how rapidly Bitcoin is gaining momentum and so on, I just don't think the euro has what it takes to keep up. There's also another assessment in the article. Global gold reserves are rising at the expense of the euro. Bitcoin is developing into a digital reserve outside of the state financial system. The US dollar is losing trust, but not automatically in favor of the euro. Rather, it's shifting toward Bitcoin, toward gold, maybe toward the Chinese currency or the BRICS nations, but not necessarily toward the euro. And then there's the whole CBDC story on top of that. I'm also really curious about that, because it's honestly a pretty devious plan to push something through that the entire population doesn't want. I mean, go ahead and write in the comments below. Who among you actually wants a CBDC, a digital euro? They think that with this, they can somehow take over the world because it's such an awesome system, but people just aren't interested at all. It's way better this way. I'm betting on a system that people actually want, like Bitcoin. And that's why I always tell you, get involved with Bitcoin. If you still want to buy Bitcoin, I'll put a link to 21 Bitcoin down below for you. Here you can buy Bitcoin easily, safely, and simply. With the code BitcoinHotel, you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin. So you can gear up and prepare yourselves here for the ECB's attack. That's probably going to get even crazier in the near future, not less intense. But they're going to lash out even more, especially as the euro and so on come under more pressure. They're going to lash out even more. Yeah, let me know what you think about this in the comments below. I'm putting the article from Blog Trainer down here. It's really very well done here, and we'll see you there. See you then. Peace out.